Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
A lot of people have asked me why I spend so much time reading ancient history and why we spend so much time talking about it on this show. It's because the faith of the Bible is a historical faith, and you really can't grasp what the Bible says unless you get context. So, today on Authentic, I'm going to talk about what you need to know about first century Palestine and what it might say about your faith and mine today.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
To try and understand the story of Jesus without understanding its historical context is to make a little bit of a caricature out of the famous Nazarene. And that makes understanding Christianity pretty difficult too. Personally, I have a fear that our generation is becoming somewhat historically illiterate, and once we lose our historical roots, we become prone to a couple of serious problems. First of all, we lose sight of the fact that the Christian faith is distinctly historical, a system of belief that continues a story that comes from the Jews. It's a story where a personal God is accomplishing His purposes by acting in our history. Secondly, without historical context, it becomes tempting to jettison elements of our faith we think are superfluous or even silly because we lack a good understanding of how those elements of the faith got there in the first place. The story of Jesus, as you find it in the Gospels, takes place under Roman occupation, an imperial nation that some people consider the world's first truly totalitarian empire. The Romans required you to be submissive, even though in some respects they granted conquered people quite a bit of freedom, especially when it came to religion. As a new subject of the Roman Empire, you were allowed to keep your own faith, as long as you also acknowledged the Roman emperor to be a god. Now, to be perfectly clear, very few people actually thought the emperor was some kind of deity because, after all, a lot of the most powerful people in Rome knew the emperor when he was a kid, and they knew full well that he was just as human as anybody else. But symbolically, the emperor represented the very spirit of Roma, the spirit of the empire. And so adding the emperor to your list of gods became a symbol of loyalty to the Romans. Of course, this presented all kinds of problems for the Jews because they would not and could not acknowledge any God but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The first commandment in their moral law said, after all, "You shall not have any gods before me." And so venerating the emperor, that was strictly off limits. That made the Jews a bit of a sticky problem for the Romans because other nations had no trouble adding the emperor to their pantheon. Because when you already have a dozen gods, what's one more? It wasn't a problem for people like the Phoenicians, but it was a problem for the world's original monotheistic religion. Add to that the troubled history that other conquerors faced when they came to the Holy Land and the indignities that Jews suffered at the hands of other empires, and the Romans found the Jews to be, well, let's say more than a handful. During the 400 years between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, the Jews had suffered persecution at the hands of a Hellenistic king named Antiochus Epiphanes, who went out of his way to make them miserable. To begin with, he built a gymnasium near the temple in Jerusalem, which doesn't sound like much of a problem. Who doesn't want a gym? Except for the fact that Greek athletes almost always practiced in the nude, like a bunch of deplorable Gentiles. In fact, the word gym comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. Then Antiochus Epiphanes took the temple itself and converted it into a temple of Zeus, where he sacrificed an unclean pig to the chief of pagan gods. So by the time the Romans came to town, it's safe to say the Jews were a little frayed. For the Jews, a Gentile occupation was not just a political problem, it was also a distinctly religious one. The land they occupied was not just some plot of real estate. It was a vital part of the Jewish faith. It was an inheritance given to their father Abraham by the one true God. Here's the way you find that described over in the book of Genesis, where it says, "And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you." The descendants of Abraham were supposed to get that land forever. And when the Romans came, it represented something more than just geographical occupation. The land was meaningfully tied to the promise of God, to the covenant with Abraham. And it was a potent symbol that God had favored Abraham's descendants. To lose control of the land to a bunch of idolatrous pagans wasn't just an insult. It was a signal that something had gone wrong with their entire faith, and it even suggested that maybe, just maybe, God had abandoned them. The historian James Carroll points out something important when it comes to Roman history. You and I tend to favor the Romans because our whole way of life is built on their empire, to one extent or another. As Westerners, we got our system of laws, our system of government, a good deal of our architecture, and our ideas of good infrastructure from the Romans. We can still see their amazing roads and aqueducts scattered all across Europe, and so we think of the Romans as a civilizing influence, a people who brought a bit of order to my ancient ancestors, the barbarians. So when Rome fell and gave way to barbarian kingdoms, we say that's the beginning of the Dark Ages, a time when civilization quite literally fell apart. Of course, we know how brutal Rome was. They persecuted, they had cruel torture and crucifixion, but on the whole, most of us tend to give the Romans a passing grade. They seem like they're kind of a good thing to us. Which brings me to James Carroll's observation from his famous book, Constantine's Sword. He writes, "To the peasant peoples of the Roman-dominated world, to the millions of slaves and petty laborers, in Rome itself fully 1 million in the population of 2 million were slaves. To the lepers and beggars, to the troublemakers whose lives could be snuffed out with little notice taken, no characterization of Caesar's evil would have been too extreme. We have looked back at Rome from above, from the point of view, that is, of those who benefited from its systems, traveled its roads, beheld its architectural wonders, learned to think in its language. But what of that vast majority who drew no such benefit? There is no understanding either the Jesus movement itself or the foundational memory of its violent conflict with the Jews if we cannot look back from below, from the vantage of those for whom the Roman systems were an endless, ever-present horror." Now, personally, most people know I'm a big fan of Roman history, and I'm one of the few Protestant ministers who likes to visit Rome more than I like to visit Jerusalem, but that's just because of my own people's history. We were the barbarians, members of the Germanic tribes that lived in the dark forests to the north, and the history of Rome is now inextricably linked to my history, especially after the fall of the empire, when the barbarians suddenly became the Holy Roman Empire, a religious empire made up of non-Romans that just picked up where Rome left off. So I'll admit, even though the Romans were pretty brutal to my ancestors, I still tend to see them with rose-colored glasses and kind of a begrudging sense of admiration. But you know, historically, James Carroll is right. For the people who lived in Palestine during the first century, Rome was pretty much a non-stop horror show, to the point where the Romans once crucified something like 2,000 resistors on the hillsides around Jerusalem, just leaving their bodies to rot in the sun. And it's not just James Carroll who makes that observation. There was an ancient Hebrew prophet who knew exactly what the Romans would be like hundreds of years before the Roman Empire even existed. And I'll be right back after this to show you what I'm talking about.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
In the 7th chapter of Daniel, a young Hebrew captive living in Babylon experiences this really strange vision where he sees odd-looking animals coming up out of the sea. It's absolutely fascinating, and here's the way he records it. Daniel 7, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. So let's get a little context for this, because this is really, really important. This is not just some senseless nightmare somebody had because they ate too much before bedtime. This is a deeply and profoundly symbolic vision. Belshazzar was the last reigning king of Babylon, or to be more accurate, he was actually just a vice-regent because his father Nabonidus was the king. But Dad liked to go out fighting wars instead of sitting on the throne, so what he did was install his son Belshazzar in the palace instead of him. Now, for those of you who know the story, you'll remember it was Belshazzar who threw a massive party the night that Babylon fell to the Persian army. And what that means for us right now in Daniel chapter 7 is we know this dream is taking place near the very end of the Babylonian Empire. Daniel finds himself standing on the shore, and he's watching the winds of heaven churn up the sea, kind of creating massive white caps and waves. And in the biblical world, the wind was a symbol of warfare and political turmoil. As the water gets more and more violent, suddenly 4 strange-looking animals walk up onto the beach, one after the other. So what in the world would that represent? It represents international warfare in the ancient world, where pagan Gentile empires tried to seize power from each other and establish themselves as the world's dominant superpower. To the Jews, God's promised land, the land that the Romans would eventually call Palestine because of the Philistines who lived there, that land was an island of God's promise in the middle of this violent Gentile sea. To the Jews, the sea was the Gentiles. I'll show you what I mean. Listen to this passage from Psalm 144 where David is praying, and he says in verse 7, "Stretch out your hand from above. Rescue me and deliver me out of great waters from the hand of foreigners." So the great waters are the troublesome foreigners that surround the land of promise. Here's another example now from the book of Isaiah chapter 17 where it says, "Woe to the multitude of many people who make a noise like the roar of the seas, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters." What Daniel is witnessing in Daniel chapter 7 is a series of Gentile nations coming up on the shores of God's promised land, and they're about to dominate the children of Abraham. And the reason this is allowed to happen is because way back when, after God established the Israelites in the land of promise, they started wishing they could be like the other nations, like the Gentiles, to the point where they actually demanded a human king. Now that was not part of God's original design. What He wanted was a nation of people who answered directly to Him, and the role of human leadership was simply to point people to the will of God. But when it looked like the prophet Samuel was going to die, God's people kind of panicked about an apparent vacuum of leadership that was coming, one that would be left behind by his death, and so they demanded a king. And here's what God said about that request over in 1 Samuel chapter 8. It says, "And the Lord said to Samuel, Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." So, from God's perspective, the request for a human monarch was actually a rejection of God's right to govern His people directly. And because God does not force people to love Him, He gave these people what they wanted. And the inevitable result of human leadership was corruption and wickedness. And it got so bad that eventually God allowed the Babylonians to come and sack the city of Jerusalem and destroy the temple and take his people captive. That's how the prophet Daniel gets to Babylon in the first place. And now he sees the future of God's people, and it is not a happy story. They wanted human leadership, and they're going to get exactly what they asked for. They want it to be like the Gentiles, so they're going to be living with Gentile domination until the very end of time. One kingdom after another is going to walk up onto the shore of the promised land. Now, the first animal Daniel sees in chapter 7 is a lion with eagle's wings, a rather well-known symbol for the Babylonian Empire. In fact, if you go to the British Museum or the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, you'll find all kinds of examples of winged lions that came straight out of Babylon. After that, we get a bear that's raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth. And it was during the reign of Belshazzar that the Persians came and sacked the city of Babylon and then went on to build the world's first truly international empire. Now, the most likely reason this bear is lopsided is because the Persian Empire itself was lopsided. It was a coalition between the Medes and the Persians, and the Persians were more easily the dominant half. The 3 ribs in its mouth, probably the 3 provinces of Babylon: Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. Then we get a 4-headed leopard with 2 sets of wings, and that represents the Macedonians or the Greeks who conquered the Persians under Alexander the Great. Of course, in time, Alexander died, and his empire was divided among his 4 generals, which is why we suddenly have a 4-headed beast. And on a side note, we know the Greeks demanded that their subjugated peoples learn to read and speak Greek, which is why it became the universal language of learning even for the early Roman Empire, which is why the New Testament was composed in Greek, even though it was written during the Roman period. Then we get the 4th beast, which of course would be the Romans. And here's where I want to slow down a bit and read the description carefully, because it completely anticipates the reality of living in 1st century Palestine. This comes from Daniel 7 verse 7, where it says, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns." Now that was exactly the experience of the 1st century Jews who lived in Palestine during the time of Christ. The Roman Empire was completely brutal, more so than any of the 3 previous Gentile kingdoms. I mean, don't get me wrong, the others were pretty brutal too, but Rome took the cake. Rome was willing to devour, to break in pieces, and to trample anything or anybody who got in her way. And that's not even the end of the story, so you sit tight because I'm coming right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Try to imagine the impact of 2,000 of your fellow countrymen, your friends and family, crucified right outside the city walls. It happened after the death of Herod the Great, a king that, well, most Jews despised because they thought of him as nothing but a Roman puppet. A massive rebellion against Rome broke out in the wake of Herod's death, and the Roman governor of Syria, a guy by the name of Publius Varus, sent in his troops to squash it by putting 2,000 rebels to death in the most cruel way imaginable. This happened, incidentally, not too far after the birth of Christ, who we believe was born sometime between 5 and 4 BC. And I know it seems like a mistake because, well, how could Jesus be born 4 or 5 years before Christ? Well, it's because we made a mistake with the dates. So, imagine today the impact of getting in your car and driving out of town and seeing the tortured bodies of your friends and family lining the shoulder of the road for miles on end, and you'll get a sense of just how devastating this event really was. What we have back in the first century is a seething anti-Roman sentiment. But at the same time, we find that the Jewish nation itself was hardly unified in its approach to the Romans. I mean, most people shared a hatred for the Romans, but they also harbored resentment against each other because of their perspectives on the problem. On the one hand, you had the Pharisees, who saw the occupation by a Gentile nation as a corrective measure from God that would bring people back to a stricter observance of the law. Then you had the Sadducees, who were the aristocrats, and they controlled a lot of what happened at the temple, and they liked cooperating with Rome whenever possible just to keep the peace because, well, maybe because they had so much power to protect. Then you had the Essenes, who saw any cooperation with Rome whatsoever as sheer treason. And they spent a lot of time preaching repentance, kind of in the style of John the Baptist. And of course, on top of all of that, society was also divided into liberals and conservatives. Some people were Hellenists who loved Greek culture and tried to bring it into the Jewish faith, and other people were zealots who didn't mind resorting to armed resistance. There was no end to the divisions among the Jews of the first century, which means that a master of conquest like Rome could easily exploit the infighting to keep the Jews from successfully resisting them. That was the world of Jesus. And to read the Gospels without understanding that is to miss a lot. There were people who expected Jesus to overthrow the Romans because they suspected he might be Messiah. And they knew full well that at the end of this prophecy in Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man receives an everlasting kingdom. In another part of Daniel in chapter 2, it tells us that after 4 key empires, a stone comes from the sky, smashes all those Gentile kingdoms, and then fills the earth with the kingdom of God. So the Jews of the first century mostly knew it was about time for Messiah to appear because they were living under the 4th pagan empire. And that's why you have people trying to crown Jesus as king. And it's the reason that so many of his followers were so disappointed when he was crucified. It seemed like something had gone horribly wrong based on their understanding of the Old Testament. You might remember the conversation that the risen Christ had with 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus over in Luke chapter 24. It says, "Then the one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to him, 'Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? And have you not known the things which happened there in these days?' And he," that's speaking of Jesus, "said to them, 'What things?' So they said to him, 'The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, today is the 3rd day since these things happened.'" When it comes to reading the Bible, context is everything. And unfortunately, far too many modern Christians restrict their reading to just the New Testament, which is entirely constructed out of the thinking of the Old Testament. To read the Gospels apart from that context in the Old Testament is to miss a lot of very important details and to get an inadequate picture of who Christ is and what he came to accomplish. Now, in the very short time that we have left, I have one more thing I want to show you. And we're going to look at the all-important historical context for us. The prophecy of Daniel didn't just show a devastating Roman Empire. It also showed a disturbing development that would come after the Roman Empire collapsed and before the return of Christ. Here it is now in Daniel 7 and verse 23. It says, "Thus he said, The 4th beast shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces." So that's the pagan Roman Empire, and we've seen that. But now watch this. Verse 24, "The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom." That's describing exactly what happened after the Western Roman Empire collapsed. It divided into fragments, kingdoms ruled by the barbarian tribes who brought the empire to its knees, people like the Germanic Goths. And the rise of the barbarians suddenly creates a new kind of Roman Empire, one where the church starts to fill the power vacuum left behind by the collapsed Roman state. What it produces is something we now call the Holy Roman Empire, which to some extent or other still kind of exists to this day. And at the peak of power, as the church in Europe laid claim to the political power of the failed Roman state, it started to behave in reprehensible ways, something all of us read about in history class, and something that every Bible-believing Christian should be willing to admit. Even though we claimed the name of Christ, we started confiscating the property of people we called heretics, and we started burning books and even burning people, and Daniel saw that coming too in verse 24. And another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and laws. The philosopher Santayana once famously said, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And you know something? He's absolutely right. It's one thing to miss details in the New Testament because we lack historical context. It's another to repeat the kinds of atrocities committed by the Roman Empire for the very same reason. We like to call the time after the collapse of Rome the Dark Ages, and it certainly fits. Not only did we lose things like culture and learning, we also forgot what the Roman Empire did to God's people in the past. And once we achieved a little bit of power, we started to do the very same things. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
It's easy to point to the pagan Romans and condemn them as the merciless brutes that they were, and frankly, they would deserve it. But if you read the whole story, the prophetic context, you read everything in this book, you discover we're no better. The moment the church in the West had a little bit of power, we just picked up where the Romans left off and we behaved abysmally. And the sad thing is this: if we had paid attention to context, if we had continued reading the entire Old Testament and paid attention to the prophecies of Daniel, we would have seen the warning. We would have seen it coming. This is why it is so important to compare everything you're going to choose to believe, not against human opinion, but against this book. And not just parts of this book, not just your favorite parts of this book, not just the Gospels, not just the New Testament. This book is meant to be read in its entirety. Context in Bible study is everything. Read the whole book. I'm Shawn Boonstra. This has been Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.